My name is Summer Pizzuro, and I'm the Chief Medical Officer of the IPG Health Network. Here to talk to us about the lack of diversity in clinical trials and the cost to society as a result is Dr. Jennifer Miller. Jennifer, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Summer, for having me. I'm excited to talk about this important topic.
Jennifer, can you tell us more about the Fair Inclusion Score?
So we launched the new set of diversity, equity, and fair inclusion measures and incorporated them into the Good Pharma Scorecard last year in 2023. And the initial focus is pretty humble. We're focusing on adequate representation and enrollment of women, older adults aged 65 and older, and racially and ethnically minoritized patients. And the measures are focused on three components. The first is transparency, whether we can tell the sex, age, or racial and ethnic identity of trial participants, whether that's publicly available, either in a registry like clinicaltrials.gov or in a publication in a medical journal like JAMA or New England Journal of Medicine. We're next looking to see how representative the demographics are of trial participants in comparison to the patient population with the targeted condition or disease. So we evaluate whether women, older adults, and racial and ethnic minoritized populations are adequately represented by comparing the composition of enrolled trial participants to that of the U.S. population diagnosed with each indication. And then lastly, we have a composite measure, which we call fair inclusion, which averages a trial's representation and transparency scores, weighting both components equally. So we were looking at novel oncology products approved by the FDA between 2012 and 2017, which was 59 new cancer therapeutics, sponsored by 25 different pharma companies, approved based on 64 pivotal trials that enrolled over 30,000 patients around the world. And what we found is that while companies and pivotal trials are pretty good about reporting the sex of enrolled participants, only about 2/3 of pivotal trials report the age and proportion of older adult participants, and only 41% of trials report the race and ethnic identity of participants. And then in terms of adequate representation, 81% of pivotal trials adequately represented women in comparison to their disease burden of various targeted conditions, but only 26%, so barely above a quarter of our pivotal trials adequately represented older adults aged 65 and older, and only 10% of trials adequately represented racial and ethnic minoritized patients identifying as Asian, Black, Latino, or white, and that's a huge public health problem.
So your initial analysis focused on new oncology treatments. Are you going to explore any other therapy areas beyond cancer?
We're actively gathering the data now to look at representation for cardiology-related products, so heart disease and the like trials. But I will say we started with cancer because that's where we have the most robust epi data. And that's because the CDC publishes the U.S. Cancer Data and Statistics, the USCS database, which you can use to estimate the demographic distribution of U.S. patients with different cancer diagnosis. But outside of oncology, it's really hard to find epi data broken out by condition and across demographic groups. You know, from a public health perspective, it's really important that we have better epi data. Now I'm curious, I actually haven't asked you this question. Why did you start focusing on clinical trial diversity?
So as a medical strategist at IPG Health, during the course of work, I was evaluating oncology clinical trial data and cross-referencing that with the target patient population that we were trying to reach. And in doing so, I became aware that the demographics within many of these clinical trials did not align, firstly, with the percentage, for example, of those racial groups within the overall population in the United States, and secondly, with the disease incidence and mortality rates for those specific populations. And I wondered, was this just an isolated incident? Is this more widespread? And I came to find out after doing research into this area that no, it's quite widespread. There are a lot of clinical trials that are not representative of the overall population. I personally believe that access to healthcare should be a basic human right. So I love your Good Pharma Scorecard. And I believe that all people, regardless of their location, their socioeconomic status, gender, disabilities, race and ethnicity should have access to clinical trials. Why? Clinical trials provide access to innovation, to novel therapies. That's where we begin our innovation process in science and research, and I believe that everyone should have access to those trials.
Yeah, diagnosing the depth of the problem is critical. It actually reminds me of a study that we did where when we had gotten research sponsors together and asked them why we had such low representation in the pre-market studies supporting FDA approval of novel products, one talking point that came out was, well, if you just looked at the post-marketing studies, the phase 4 studies, you would see increased diversity and representation and enrollment. And so we went ahead and actually did that study, and we found in many cases a decrease in demographic representation in post-marketing trials. So a lot of what we do is myth busting, right, or trying to understand the prevalence and depth of a problem. So it's really great to hear you're doing the same thing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miller, for taking the time to speak with us and share your brilliant insights. Thank you to our viewers. Like and subscribe to watch more of our clinical equality sessions featuring academics and clinicians working to create change. Together, we can make clinical trials worth more. Join us. Visit clinicalequality.com.